Now, for those of you that have been following the channel, you will know that I recently did purchase an AM5 system. It was my first and it was going to be the replacement for my personal gaming machine, but I had horrible trouble with it and I had to send it back. And in the end, I decided to go for an Intel-based system. And that was the first time in a very long time that I've gone Intel, and it worked flawlessly. But I told you guys I was not going to give up on the Ryzen 7000, so I've got some new things in, and I thought today we could actually get it working together. The major difference between what I've got here today and what I had before was obviously down to cost. I'm not willing to actually put that much money into a system that is completely unstable, but I am willing to put a little less money into something for the studio to just have a bit of a play with AM5 and see what all the performance is like. And I'm sure you guys can already tell that this is a much more budget-friendly option from AMD at the moment. For the CPU, I picked up the AMD Ryzen 5 7600X. Now, that CPU was a little bit cheaper than the standard 7600, and that's why I generally picked it up. But of course, you don't get the cooler inside the box. It's just a very very lightweight box, to be honest. You don't get a lot for your money anymore, I suppose. But the CPU should be faster than the standard, so it kind of makes sense, really, particularly if you're going to be fitting your own cooler anyway. For the RAM, I've decided to pick up this Corsair Vengeance. It's pretty plain, pretty basic, and it is a kit of 5600 megahertz, so it should be pretty standard for any kind of system. Hopefully, this will have no issues in the system. I know that AM5 is having a lot of problems with DDR5 at the moment, but I've not actually heard any bad things about this kind of set yet, so I'm sure we'll find out when we come to build. For the board, I've gone for something a little bit basic. Now, this is probably the most basic board that you can actually purchase on any platform, really. It is an MSI board. I've had really good luck with MSI boards recently, so I'm hoping that will be on my side. And it is from their Pro series. It is the Pro A620M-E, which means it's actually a micro ATX board. I don't tend to use micro ATX boards, but recently I've had quite a few in and I'm kind of getting a bit of a love for them. But it is an extremely basic board. It is lacking a lot of features, even some of the most basic things that you get with standard boards, but I'm hoping that it will work. Now, being a basic board, it didn't actually cost that much, but then considering that it probably cost double what AMD's previous generation boards of this caliber would have cost, I actually paid around £86 for this. In the grand scheme of things, that doesn't sound like a lot, but considering on the AM4 platform, you used to be able to get the A320 boards for around £30 to £40. Of course, this is probably double that now, so should you actually go and buy one of these? Probably not, unless you're actually just going to do some testing like we are, but I'm sure the board will work perfectly fine anyway. Storage isn't anything fancy. I'm just going to drop in a PCI Gen 3 NVMe. This is literally just for us to get this up and running and see if we can actually get it stable. I've got really good hopes for this system because I've not heard many complaints around this processor. Apparently, there's a lot of issues with the X3Ds, but I'm sure we'll see as we build it. Now, like I said before, the board is extremely basic. They're very small boards. I think they're actually pretty cute, to be honest. You could build some nice little micro ATX systems with these, and I'm sure lots of people do, particularly considering the price of a lot of the latest generation components. But it will give us everything that we actually need. We've obviously got a PCI Express slot. We've got 2 slots for our DDR5 RAM. Of course, you can only use DDR5 for AM5. You don't have the luxury like you do with a lot of the Intel boards at the moment, where you can either get them in DDR4 and get really super cheap RAM, or DDR5, which costs you a little bit more, but probably is a little bit more future-proof. AM5 only supports DDR5, which is why we had to get the extra kit. The socket, of course, is now LGA. We don't have any pins on our CPU, and I haven't actually unboxed the CPU yet, but I'm sure we'll have a look at that in a minute. But overall, it's a generally decent board, and hopefully it will get us up and running. Like I said before, the CPUs, you don't really get a lot. You get this tiny little box that you have to unwrap, and all we have to do is just put down the back seal there, and we'll just package it out, and you guys can just see how well these are packaged. I'm sure you guys saw the 7800X3D. I did some photos and stuff on the community tab and on social media. It was actually packaged very nicely and very plush, but I'm kind of guessing this is a little bit different. So if we open it up, we can see that we've got the little CPU here inside its little plastic thing. It's nice to know that they still include the clamshells, even though the CPU doesn't have pins on it. I'm sure they could have come up with a different way. As you can see, it's a completely flat area, and it's an LGA socket, so the pins are actually on the motherboard, just like they used to be on Intel and still are. But you have this really nice distinct kind of shaping on the top here. Now, when I did actually install the 7800X3D, I did use a contact plate, particularly when we come to do the final full build, and I wanted to stop thermal paste from getting all into the CPU. We're not going to be using a contact plate today, so I'm sure I'm going to make an absolute mess of this, but generally I do like the look of the CPUs. They look very nice, but Are they actually built very well in terms of, you know, being user friendly and cleanable? I don't know. Well, I'm sure we'll find that out as we go along. Now, just like Intel motherboards, we have to lift this little arm here. So we'll just lift that up, and then of course we need to expose our socket. We do not want to drop anything in here because we could just bend pins just like you can on Intel processors. All we want to do is gently drop our AMD Ryzen CPU into the slot so it's nice and comfy there. Now, as we shut the door, it should actually pop this little bracket off once we actually start locking it down. So let's just give it a push and see what happens. Okay, so half the bracket has popped off, but just lifting it up there can actually release it. And there we have our CPU nicely in the socket. Installing the RAM is obviously exactly the same as it was for DDR4. All we need to do is drop these little pins back, locate our memory, and I think it goes that way round, making sure that our notch lines up. And then we just simply drop it into the board. Now, of course, you don't get a cooler with this processor. They just don't provide one at all. So you're going to have to find your own if you are going to purchase this kind of kit. This is a Wraith Max, I believe, and it's got a little bit of RGB on it, but that's irrelevant. It does use the little clip system from the AM4 slots. It's not a screw down one, which should be compatible with an AM5. And we should be able to just mount that down. So we need to fit this cooler, obviously get our thermal paste in there. And what we're going to do is we're actually going to drop this board onto one of my test benches. So it'll be on an open air test bench, and then we'll see if we can actually get it to post. We've got the board and everything loaded onto the test bench, and of course we just need to now switch the power on and see if we can actually get it to boot. As long as we get a picture on, we're actually pretty happy at the moment. I don't know what is on that SSD. It may be an operating system, but of course we don't want to leave that one. We're going to reinstall a fresh new one because we're trying to see if we get the same problems here as we did with the previous setup, and using an old SSD is not going to be able to do that. So let's hit the power switch and see if we actually get a picture. After a few minutes of red lights on the actual motherboard, and I was a bit worried there that it wasn't actually going to start, it did actually display a bit of a picture. It came up with the new CPU installed error message, so hopefully once it's kind of redone whatever it's doing, we'll get one. So here we do, we actually do have a picture. It says it's the AMD Ryzen 5 7600X. We're just going to see now if we can actually get into the BIOS. It might actually boot into Windows depending on what's on that SSD. I'm not quite sure, but we'll keep hitting delete and we'll see what actually happens. There we go. So we are now in the BIOS. Everything seems to be reading. We can see that we've got a CPU here, or should I say motherboard of the Pro A620M-E. That is the motherboard that we're using. We've got a CPU of AMD Ryzen 5 7600X 6-core processor, which is correct. And then the memory size is 32 gigabytes. Now, there is no XMP enabled or anything like that. We've done nothing to this so far. This is literally the first boot. And to be honest, the previous 7800X 3D system would actually get this far. We had issues actually later on, particularly when we were starting to do things. So what I will do now is I'm going to go and reinstall Windows onto that drive. I'm going to get a fresh copy of probably Windows 11. It's reasonably stable nowadays. And we'll then get it into Windows, and we'll reiterate a few of the things that we did on the previous system, and we'll see if we get the same results. Now, apparently the system doesn't want us to get into Windows. I don't know why, but we've dropped our USB stick in and we've headed over to the BIOS to get it to boot from the USB stick, because there is a copy of Windows on that drive. And unfortunately, it just won't detect the keyboard and mouse inside the BIOS. I assume that's probably a BIOS issue with the motherboard and being such a cheap motherboard, but we're going to let this one slide and we're going to try and do it a different way. So we'll get Windows installed and then we'll see, make sure that Windows actually detects those peripherals. Otherwise, we're going to be pretty much stuck when we get there. Now, Windows is installed and it installed perfectly fine. There was absolutely no issues. And to be honest, the system is actually pretty nippy. I'm quite impressed with these Ryzen 7000 CPUs. Even the 7800X 3D was really nippy when it was in Windows, much different to the previous generations. I don't really know how to explain it, but things are just instant the second you click them. But we've managed to get into Windows, and to be honest, we managed to do that on the last setup, to be honest. Where we did get some issues was when we were actually restarting the system. It just wouldn't come back. So let's try giving this a few restarts. So we'll hit that. We'll go to here and we'll go restart, restart, restart. So apparently restarting is actually perfectly fine. I've done it a few times now, and it's actually got straight back into Windows with no issues. The 7800X 3D did have a few issues when we did that. Now and again, it wouldn't exactly get back into Windows. We'd either crash on the way or we'd blue screen of death once we got into Windows, at least once on a 2 or 3 restart cycle. But this one's actually working perfectly fine. The next test is actually shutting it down and turning off the power. Now, with the 7800X 3D, when we completely disconnected the power from the system and had a completely new reboot, maybe the next day or something, it wouldn't actually boot at all. It literally just died even before it got into Windows itself sometimes, and I had to just restart it a few times just to get it to actually boot into anything. So we'll do that, we'll shut it down, and then what we'll do is we'll disconnect the power at the power supply itself once it's gone off, and we'll leave it for a few seconds, and then we'll see what exactly happens, see if it actually comes back or not. So it's been off for a few seconds, and the big test now is to turn it back on. We've actually got a few lights pop up, but they've gone straight out. That's actually a good sign. With the 7800X3D, the lights would actually stick there for a long time, and then you kind of knew that it wasn't going to happen, but they've actually gone off on this one. We've got a display. It's actually loading up into Windows. There's no crashes. We've actually got to the Windows login screen. So that's actually passed that test too, one that the previous system wouldn't actually do. But of course, the biggest issue we had with the original system really was once we actually got into Windows and we got the system into this state, as soon as we added a graphics card, everything was 10 times worse. We just couldn't get any kind of displays. Drivers would just drop out for no reason, even after a few recycles to actually get into the operating system itself. So what we'll do is we'll drop in a graphics card. The one that I'm going to drop in is this little one from MSI. This is an RX 6400. The only reason I've picked this one is because it doesn't require any additional power cables, but with the previous system, I tried lots of different cards. I tried this one, I tried NVIDIA cards, I even tried an Intel card just to see if it was like a driver related thing or not, and to be honest, they were all exactly the same. So what we'll do is we'll get this card installed, get the drivers installed, and then we'll see if it will actually get back into Windows again. The RX 6400 is now in the system and it's actually booted up into Windows perfectly fine. Of course, there were no drivers installed. With the previous system, we could actually get this far once we did a few cycles. This one didn't require any kind of cycles at all. It just went straight in. We are installing the AMD Radeon drivers now for this graphics card, and hopefully it will flicker the screen a few times as we're doing this, but hopefully it'll actually come back. Again, one of the other issues that the 7800X3D had is once you had the graphics card in and you were installing the drivers, if it did this where it went to a bit of a black screen and it flickered a little bit, sometimes it wouldn't even come back. It would just literally die, and then you had to restart the whole driver install again. So this one has come back. We've hit 99%, 100%, and the drivers are installed. So that's another test passed, but what we'll do is we'll restart the system and actually see if it does come back, because that is a real big test here. That is where the previous system had major flaws, where it would just get into Windows, hang, and then just die and crash. And it didn't matter what we did. We changed so much configuration in the BIOS. We followed so many different guides. We just couldn't get it stable at all. Now and again, we could get the system into Windows, even with the graphics card itself. You tried to restart the system again the next day and it was all over again. And you had to just rebuild from Windows again, just to even get it into an operating system to do anything. So we'll just hit restart and see if it comes back. And success, we've actually got back into Windows with the graphics card installed and the drivers installed as well. So this is clearly now a much more stable platform than what I had before. Was it the motherboard before? Was it the memory before? I'm not quite sure. I did try this memory in that system, as well as the memory that is currently running in the Intel system that I originally purchased for that 7800X3D. And neither of them would work, so I don't know. Could it have been the CPU? Could it have been a faulty CPU? I don't know. I'm sure at some point we'll get another 7800X3D, or at least one of the X3D chips, and we'll give this another go. But at least this has given me an AM5 platform that I can tinker with, play with, show you guys some stuff. I'm sure we'll be benchmarking it at some point, but let's do a final test. We've got Steam installed, and we're going to just kick off one of the games that we've got. We've actually just installed one of my favorite games. You guys, if you watch this channel a lot, you will know that it is my favorite game, and that game is, of course, Half-Life 2. The only reason that I've decided to just quickly test this is because it's such a small game to download, and it didn't take that long to do. Now, I've cranked the settings up on this game because, of course, this card can handle this game perfectly fine. Well, I hope it can. It's a reasonably new card for an old game, and the game is playing beautifully smooth. I don't know what the FPS currently is, but there is absolutely no issues in playing this. So the system is working fine. Everything is nice and cool. It's quiet. I'm actually reasonably impressed now with AM5. I was sorely disappointed with the original 7800X3D system, and that's because it costs so much. AMD are not the cheap brand that they used to be anymore. They are actually excelling in their kind of CPU technologies. They are catching up, or they have caught up with Intel in terms of processing power now. So they're asking a premium price. And when you ask a premium price for something, it's just got to work straight out of the box, just like this one has. So this is the system that I'm going to go with going forward. You guys are going to see it many more times in the future. I've got so much plans with this now that I know it's working and that it's really stable. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel if you want to see those videos, because of course they're going to be coming to you soon. And I'm sure, as always, guys, we'll catch you in the next one.